And the words, the scandal of youth unemployment that Pope Francis used are strong, are intense, and charged with meanings. And I think we could probably start from there to frame our discussion, because a scandal, what is a scandal? A scandal is not only a serious breach of the ethical code, a serious wrongdoing, but a scandal has two features. First of all, it can become contagious. It can have systemic effects. Youth unemployment is not only a problem by itself, but it generates demotivation in youth. It generates mistrust, disorder, political radicalization, extremism. It can have negative effects on family formation, on skills, on poverty, on incomes, condemning, if you want, a generation for life, a lost generation. And the second trait, which is interesting when we talk of scandals, is that it's perceived, it's felt by the community as an outrage. It's an offense, somehow, that we perceive in relation to something wrong, because it touches the values, the inner values on which we build our identity. If you want, it erodes the social capital of a community. That's why we call it a scandal. And if you think of unemployment, youth unemployment in particular, it erodes the future. It deprives us of the future, because without youth, and without youth in employment, there is little hope, less expectations about the future. So in this sense, a scandal is not simply any wrongdoing, but it's something that puts us straight into the normative dimension. So I think in this discussion, we should probably go well beyond the analysis. We need analysis, but we need also to understand what are we doing wrong? What are we not doing right? And what should we rather do? What is our collective or individual responsibility? Who does what? And how can we avoid contagion and strengthen social capital? In the session, we will be focusing on the digital economy. We try to address, I think Alfredo Pastor was very good in explaining the framework, the challenges that we have if you want to manage technological change, including the disruptions, the dislocations, the fractures that technological change can bring with it, and how we create conditions for translating technological change into jobs, into opportunities. And this is a formidable challenge. It's a formidable challenge because we need to transform what is and can be a vicious circle into a virtuous circle and create positive interdependence rather than contagion, negative interdependence. And also we need to invest in social capital. We need to strengthen the values of our community. But this is a challenge that it's not new. I mean, we have been facing these challenges for centuries, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We have been able to manage it. We have addressed it in the past. And so we can meet it, we can address it for the future. So I think there is this recent book, Robert Baldwin, The Great Convergence, which shows that the last 20 years we have seen a great change in the way globalization affects incomes and access to incomes by the different parts of the world. I think while we had in the century, from the beginning of the 19th century onwards, a great divergence, and from 20% of income at the global level, developed countries were able to get to 70% of income. In the last 20 years, we've seen the reverse. We have seen the reverse. And that also explains why I think now to bear the brunt of these global supply chains are not only the developing world, but more the middle classes of our developed world. So great changes, and I think we have a great panel here to discuss these issues. And so without much further ado, I would like to now give an opportunity to the panel speakers to talk. And it's my pleasure now to introduce them to you. We start with the first speaker, James Besson. It's a real pleasure to have him with us. And I'm very grateful to Alfredo Pastor, who, through his contact, we got in touch with him. Now, Professor Besson, James is not only a great scholar, a successful publisher of books in the economics of innovation, but he's also a lawyer, expert in patent law. And also, he is an innovator himself. I was very curious to know that he developed some programs so he's a creator of innovation himself. By the way, you see, a common trait of the people on the panel here is that in their career, in their life, they have not been good or very good only in one thing, but they have been good and very good in several things, which I find puzzling, because as a teacher, in our university system, we tend to encourage our students to specialize and hyper-specialize and get very good and if you want, split in the air. While I think the people around this table, they've really developed their skills around a diverse set of skills and competencies. So, having said that, the floor is now to James Besser for his talk. You have 25 minutes.
Can you hear me? Okay. So my talk is called Scarce Skills, Not Scarce Jobs. The disruptive effect of new technologies is very much in the news these days. One area that's frequently cited is the tremendous decline in manufacturing employment throughout the developed world, but also now we're seeing it in the developing world. Even China is seeing manufacturing jobs decline as a portion of the total workforce. This chart shows the decline in textile jobs in the U.S. In the 1940s and 50s, we had nearly 500,000. Today, there are 16,000, a huge drop. Most of that is due to technology, some to globalization, but most of it to technology. And now we're seeing new technologies coming on that promise to be even more potent. Artificial intelligence technologies can read lips better than humans. They can beat humans at chess, at Go, at Jeopardy. They can do better than a radiologist or the average radiologist in analyzing X-rays for cancers. Some people see this and predict that this means imminent mass unemployment. The famous paper of several years ago predicted that nearly half of the employment in the US would be potentially automatable over a decade or two. So is this the right prediction? I argue that it's not, that we are seeing a very disruptive effects of technology, but the real impact is not that the total number of jobs is disappearing. Some jobs certainly are disappearing, but other jobs are being created. And the real difficulty is getting people to have the skills to work those new jobs. This is an important distinction to make, because in order to have the right treatment, we have to have the right diagnosis. We have to really understand what's going on in terms of coming up with the right policies. And so that's what I will focus my talk on. So the first key idea is, and Alfredo referred to this, automation can create jobs as well as destroy jobs. This is a textile mill from the United States of about 1910, and you will notice it's not a great picture, but there are very few workers and very many machines. In fact, the best mills at that time had 24 machines to each worker, each weaver. This is a weaving room. Over the course of the 19th century, 98% of the labor that went into producing a yard of cloth was automated. Did that mean a huge destruction of weaving jobs? If I show you the total graph that I began the talk with, in fact, you see not, that there in fact was tremendous growth in weaving employment throughout the 19th century and into the 1920s in the US, all the while tremendous automation going on, about 3% a year. So what changed? How did this happen, and why did it change? And what does that tell us about technologies today? And the critical notion, the thing that people forget, is that automation has a tremendous effect on demand. Automation and technologies more generally reduce prices or improve quality or deliver new products, and this makes consumers buy more, motivates consumers to buy more. And so what happened with textiles was automation meant that less labor was required to produce a yard of cloth, but then the price reduced just as well, just proportionally. And at a lower price, consumers demanded much more cloth. At the beginning of the 19th century, people had very little cloth. It was very expensive. The typical person in the U.S. had one set of clothing and very little other use of cloth. It was mostly made at home. It was very, very tedious to make. Today, we have full closets of clothing. We have upholsteries. We have draperies, all made with cloth. Even though the technology has continued to automate textile production at about the same rate for 200 years now, where in the beginning of the 19th century it motivated people to buy a lot more, today further price reductions just don't induce people because we have lots of clothes, we don't need much more. And so that's what changed and why automation led to job growth for 100 years and has now led to job declines for over 50 years. Well, what about today's technologies? Where are we on that cycle? And in fact, you can see lots of examples where new technologies, including some that were predicted to eliminate many jobs, have in fact created jobs. So barcode scanners came in the 1980s, and it was predicted that they would eliminate cashiers. They took over about 20% of the work that a cashier did, but in fact, there are more cashiers. E-commerce came in, and there are more salespeople since 2000. Electronic discovery of legal documents came in, and you have people pronouncing the end of lawyers and the end of paralegals, and in fact, the number of paralegals and lawyers has been growing. So we're very much, in many of these industries, in much of the service and healthcare and education sectors, very much in the phase of the 19th century as it was for manufacturing. My favorite example is the automated teller machine, which was predicted to eliminate the bank teller. The dashed line shows you the number of ATM machines, which were largely installed in the U.S. between 1995 and 2005. But in fact, the number of bank tellers grew. And again, it's very much a demand story. There were fewer tellers required to operate a bank branch. That meant it was cheaper for the banks to open a new branch office. And in order to provide more services, different services, and to compete more effectively, they just opened a whole lot more branch offices. And as a result, the number of tellers actually increased, even though fewer were required per branch. So there's this very dynamic effect of demand. And in much of the non-manufacturing sector, what we see is an association between IT use, information technology use, and job growth. In manufacturing, because it's such a mature market for the most part, we're seeing job declines. And so the real difference is manufacturing has satiated demand. These are, demand for textiles is satiated. It's a mature market. But if we look at finance, if we look at healthcare, if we look at education, other service sector industries, new technology is creating new demand, it's creating new products, it's creating new services, and so demand grows. So the lesson here is the impact of technology on jobs depends on demand, and the nature of demand changes slowly. So over the next 10 or 20 years, the impact of information technology is likely to continue what it's been for the last 30 years. That is, we're likely to see actually more jobs being created overall. Longer term, beyond 10 or 20 years, 30, 40, 50 years, very hard to say. It's a different story, and I'll get back to that. Nevertheless, even though we're creating more jobs, we're also creating winners and losers, and that's I think, the key story. So these are the typesetters at the New York Times in the 1940s. The number of typesetters collapsed. They were largely automated by desktop publishing software that came in. I was one of the people who developed some of that software. At the same time, though, there was a substitution. It's not that the machines came in and replaced the humans. It's that humans using machines, graphic designers or desktop publishers, took over the work from the typesetters who were using older machines. So work transferred, and what you actually see is that the number of graphic design jobs has grown robustly, in fact, much more than the decline in typesetter jobs. So there are winners and losers, but the issue is those typesetters need to get new skills in order to get graphic design jobs. And so we're seeing overall this pattern occurring in many industries and many occupations, but it tends to be the lower wage occupations that are losing employment and the middle or higher, especially higher wage occupations that are gaining employment. Now, if we could make that transition very easily, this wouldn't be much of a problem. If we could convert those typesetters to graphic designers very easily. And I know typesetters who became graphic designers, but it wasn't necessarily an easy problem. And you have to think about why is it hard, perhaps, to learn new technologies? And I think there are two major reasons. One is that the technologies are not standardized, that there are many different versions of new technologies, and you might learn one, but it's another one that tends to be the one where you can get a job, and it's rapidly changing. So as a result of that, it makes it difficult for the schools to keep up. They don't necessarily have people trained in the latest technologies. Things aren't standardized, so you can't necessarily have it in a textbook. As a result, people have to learn on their own. They have to learn on the job, learning by doing, which is the title of my book. And at the same time, also, labor markets aren't very good at recognizing what the new skills are and rewarding them. So you have stagnant pay for the average worker, and you have growing wage inequality. So I'll give you an example. Let's talk about the typesetters and compositors. They originally learned skills in the US in a 4-year apprenticeship program run by the union. In came the new technology, and all of a sudden it was print designers and desktop publishers who had very different sorts of skills. Many of the skills overlap, but it was a different sort of skill. They tended to learn their skills in graphic design schools. But then the internet came along, and all of a sudden they needed to have web designer skills. And smartphones came along, and they needed to have mobile designer skills, which turned out to be different. And there are all new sorts of specialties growing up: information architects, user interaction specialists in these new fields. And very often, the graphic design schools don't have people who can teach these skills. And the standards are changing. So a few years ago, Flash was a standard on most websites. It's now seen largely as being obsolete, being replaced by HTML5. You don't need to know what these things are, just that they were important to these people. And it changed very rapidly. So people had to learn on their own. For the average designer, this was a difficult problem. So the schools couldn't teach them. Even if they had experience, the labor markets didn't necessarily recognize their skills. For the top designers, the best people were able to teach themselves, and they could develop a reputation so that they could get good pay. And so what you see is the average designer is experiencing stagnant pay, while the top designer is experiencing rising pay. So this leads to growing wage inequality within the occupation, and different access to these new technologies leads to a growing divide between people who are using the new technologies and people who are not. So jobs are shifting from typically low-wage occupations or some mid-wage occupations to higher wage or higher skill occupations. Wages are growing faster for IT users than they are for non-IT users, and not everybody gets the chance to work with the new technology and learn the new skills. This is particularly a problem for youth. So if you think historically, young workers were very often the pioneers of new technology. If you go and think about the textile industry, in the US, it was young, in the US, in Japan, in China, as each industrialized in the textile industry, it was young women typically who learned the new skills and played a critical role. In the early 20th century in the US, it was new high school graduates who were learning the new electrical-related technologies. What about information technology? It's certainly true that young people are very familiar with computers, especially on their phones. But we have this tragedy of very high youth unemployment in some countries, Southern Europe being in the 50% range. That poses a real obstacle. it means that those youth are not only being failed economically, but they're also missing out the opportunity to work with new technology that was going to give them the skills to prosper. Now, by comparison to the U.S., and I'm not holding the U.S. necessarily as an example of the ideal labor system, but it gives us a clue. We're not seeing the same level of youth unemployment. And what that says, at least, is that this is an avoidable tragedy, that there are policies that labor market policies that can influence how youth does. Maybe the U.S. doesn't have necessarily the best policy, but at least it raises the possibility that youth unemployment is something that could well be addressed, in the current framework. And even in the U.S., we're seeing inequities growing up, so that younger workers have less have less access to working with information technology. They're less likely to use a computer or the internet at work than are people over the age of 24. So this means sort of a growing divide. It means that young workers are missing the opportunity to develop these skills. All right, so what sorts of policies can we think about? In my book, I go into some detail, so I'll just sketch some general ideas here. So one is many of the critical skills have to be learned through experience on the job because things are changing rapidly, because the schools can't keep up, things are not standardized. So we're seeing new experiments coming along. Work-study programs. Many companies are pairing up with local community colleges, for instance, and setting up these programs where somebody goes to the classroom part of the week, but also learns skills and applies the classroom lessons on the job. We're seeing new experiments with apprenticeship. Apprenticeship has been a strong staple of the German labor market. But even in Germany, the nature, it's being challenged by new technologies. And we're seeing other countries, including the US, experimenting with new forms of apprenticeship where the importance of learning on the job is recognized. We're seeing new efforts at certification, many of them developed by industries, but certifying skills that are learned on the job. Now, skills that are learned in the classroom as well, but skills learned on the job are particularly important. So somebody who works with a new technology can take a test and demonstrate that they have the capabilities needed to work for another employer in that technology. And what that does is it allows labor markets to work much more effectively. The key often to getting rewarded for a worker to get a reward for investing in learning a new technology is to find another employer who's willing to bid up wages and pay them for their skills so that they are fully compensated for what they've learned. Education, of course, is important, but I think in many countries, and I think the U.S. is one of them, there's been an overemphasis on college education and not enough emphasis on the other ways that people need to learn, particularly for mid-skill jobs. So we need to think more broadly. The challenge of skills is not just a challenge of education. Another sort of issue that affects the ability to transform I should say something else about education, which is I think we need to think, one of the lessons is we're entering this era where we're going to see rapidly changing technologies for a long period of time. And we have to change from an education system that thinks very much of you learn something at school and it's good for the rest of your career to one where what you need to learn at school is how to learn, how to teach yourself so that in 5 years or 10 years when there's a new technology and what you knew is becoming obsolete, you can transition more easily to something new. Employee mobility is a key also to making those transitions. So in the US, and I think it's true in many other countries, we're actually seeing declining employee mobility. So in the US, it's been well established that workers are less likely to relocate geographically. If They are less likely to take new jobs. They are less likely to change occupations. And all of these things make it more difficult for people to transition to new opportunities. We're seeing a number of policies that contribute to that decline in mobility. So in the US, one thing that's become very prevalent, especially for technical workers, is non-compete agreements. Technical workers, and not only technical workers, you've got yoga instructors and pizza delivery people being forced to sign agreements saying that if they leave their job, they will not work for another employer in the same industry for a year or two. This places a tremendous burden, and it places a tremendous penalty on anybody who wants to learn new skills. We're seeing a growth of occupational licensing. It's important to license people where critical health and safety matters are involved. But in the US, I think there's a wide feeling among economists that this has become very excessive. About a third of the workforce is subject to occupational licenses, including many occupations that it would seem ridiculous. Hair braiding, people have to get licensed, and we have African immigrants who have practiced hair braiding as part of their culture for centuries, have been shut down from practicing their craft because of these licensing restrictions. In a similar vein, we're seeing an expansion of trade secret and patent protection in ways that these are both important protections for encouraging innovation, but they have been extended in certain ways, and we can get into the legalities if somebody's really interested, that limit the ability of employees to learn new knowledge and take it to other workplaces, which has historically been a key factor in developing new technologies. And of course, I think in Europe in particular, job protections are perhaps one of the reasons why we're seeing such high youth unemployment in some countries and a lack of mobility. A third area is standardization. So it's important, it takes time, but new technologies have to converge on common, widely accepted standards. Open standards bodies are often very important, and so we're seeing lots of developments in this area. In many cases, companies will try to control that process. On the other hand, I think there's sort of a public interest in having an open standard that anyone can access and use. This encourages the sharing of knowledge of new technologies. In the book, I describe how things such as even government procurement has sometimes been worked very well for encouraging sharing of new knowledge of technologies. In the US, government procurement has been important in developing computers and semiconductors and the internet and spreading that knowledge around. On the other hand, procurement policies are often designed to limit the spread of knowledge, and that works against this standardization process, which is key not only for spreading the technology, but for allowing people to develop new skills. So what does this tell us? New technology can create widely shared wealth, but the key to having that occur is having widely shared skills, widely acquired skills, and that's a major challenge. It's a challenge that we can meet over the next 10 or 20 years if we work hard, but it's the challenge that we face. It's the crisis that we're facing now caused by technology. In the long term, we're going to face different challenges. In the long term, it may well be that new technology does more to replace humans than to augment them. You know, what we're seeing now is it's not an issue of jobs, a shortage of jobs, it's a shortage of skills. That may be a different story 30, 40, 50 years from now. I think it's very hard to predict. There are a couple of reasons for thinking that things may get worse in that dimension. One is, as new technologies become more sophisticated, it becomes more possible for a technology to completely replace a human. Although we've experienced intensive automation in many industries for 200 years now, very few occupations have been completely replaced by machines. This in fact happens very rarely. For instance, I did a study where I looked at the number of all the detailed occupations in the U.S. Census in 1950, and only one of those occupations was largely eliminated thanks to automation, and that was the occupation of elevator operator. Now, at the same time, there was a huge amount of automation affecting jobs in all sorts of occupations and all sorts of industries, but it was mostly partial automation. It was mostly the kind of thing where the machine comes in and does some tasks, but it doesn't do everything. We're going to see the elevator operator example happen more often in the future. I think it's very unclear how quickly this will occur. I think the most threatened sorts of jobs are trucking jobs, certain warehouse jobs. That's going to become more of a threat and more of a concern in the future, and it's going to change the nature of the impact of technology. The other reason to be concerned is, if you recall the textile it went up for 100 years, but then it went down. And if we expect the same sort of thing to happen in the service sector, in the healthcare sector, in finance, whatever, we might very well expect that at some point in the future we're going to have experienced the same sort of problem in those sectors. So we're going to face a deeper and more important challenge. Nevertheless, I will say that the challenge we need to focus on is the one facing us today, the shortage of skills, and for two reasons. One is because it's a tremendous scandal that we have so many unemployed youth who are not acquiring the skills, because it's the challenge we face today, and as long as we do so, we're going to have a lot of people who are out of work or earning less than they should be and widening inequality. But the other reason is really a more strategic and long-term reason. If we're going to face a difficult challenge around work issues in 30, 40, 50 years, we're going to be much better positioned to address that challenge if we've solved the challenge we're facing today. If we build a society and a workforce that has well-developed skills, that will have trust in our institutions and confidence in policies that can promote a fair distribution of the benefits of new technology. If we do not, when we come and encounter a difficult period in the future, we're going to have a much more difficult problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you also for staying within the time. And I think the strong message we get is very reassuring, that we should focus on opportunities. In no way, because there are losers. There is turmoil, global disruptions. In no way we should think that the balance is going to be negative. It can be, it has been positive, it can be positive, and so I think we should really invest in adaptability, employability, skills, and also a reference to the education sector. What I've read, I think we probably get back to it in the discussion from your presentation, is that there are concrete examples. It's not only the theory, but there are concrete examples where this has proved that it can work. I mean, the dual system that we find it in Germany and in many northern European countries, it works. And unemployment, youth unemployment there is much lower than elsewhere. Mobility, you made reference to mobility. The Erasmus program in the European Union works. It's very useful in terms of enabling people to adjust and to look for jobs where they are, not expecting jobs to come to where they are. I mean, I greatly benefit, I must say, in my youth from the Fulbright scholarships, and I think that also was a program that worked well. Okay, I'm sure we will have an opportunity to get back to all these questions, but now I think it's time for the other panelists to step in, and I have the pleasure of now giving the floor to Carlo da Zarobiondo. Carlo has a very important position in Google. He's President of Strategic Relations for the whole European, Middle East and Africa region. And I don't need to tell you what Google is and what Google does, but except for one thing probably, Carlo, allow me to say, because it's often neglected. I mean, we know Google quality products, champion of the digital economy, but it's also a quality employer. It invests a lot in providing a working environment which is attractive, it's stimulating. from what I hear, it's a pleasure to work at Google, and I think they make sure that people there they are stimulated, but he probably will make reference to this. Carlo, you have the floor for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and in particular to speak on behalf of a company that is somehow participating to the changes we are all living. What I would like to do is talk a little bit about what I've learned at Google in the last decade and share it with you and talk about jobs a little bit. At start, I would like to acknowledge an issue. When we are here in Europe, whether it's Italy, France, Germany, and if, for example, we go outside this room and we look around us, we see fabulous architecture. We see around us a past of beauty that has been constructed by generations after generation. So the reaction we have to that when we see change coming is to look at the past and protect ourselves. We want to keep what we have built over generations, and this is normal. It's human. It's also beautiful. However, the change that is occurring challenges that. And the risk is that if we look at the past and believe the past is more beautiful than the future, we lose the possibility to participate to that challenge. And in that sense, Asiatics and Americans have been more successful than us in Europe into facing the challenge. Second point, technology. First of all, I think what Professor Besson said is very valuable, important, positive, because it gives us an ability to understand what to target. However, to me, the issue is not technology. The change we are living is not a change of technology. Technology is only a mean. It's a change of communications. If you think about it, the internet is the first time, maybe after the Babel Tower, and I hope we'll do better on the Babel Tower, but it's the first time humans all speak the same language. It's a protocol. It's an agreement on a protocol on speaking the same language. At the beginning, you had machines speaking this language, only big computers, then PCs, now fridges, now lots of things. And because this language is used by so many machines, the depth of our interactions can improve. Why do companies like Google or Facebook or any internet company are so successful in that, and what shall we do about it? I think that success comes from two elements. One, they understand this inherent language issue, and they bet on the openness. A platform like Android and iOS serve the entire population. They avoid fragmentations. They allow small and medium companies to invest once into developing a service and touching the whole population. This openness, when you use it, when you somehow leverage it, is very powerful and puts small and medium companies in the same conditions as big companies into competition. This is a big change. Of course, it's disruptive for these companies. But it allows small and medium companies to evolve. To tell you a story, I have a friend in Alsace who built bathtubs, beautiful bathtubs, expensive. Then the Germans arrived and said, we can do bathtubs more economical. But then, thanks to the web, he can sell his bathtubs all over the world, so he can live again. So this element of competition is of extreme importance. The second element of reason why those companies are successful, I think, as I've been living it for now 20 years in this world, is they start from the user. We have a tendency in Europe to start from ourselves. We look at the way we do things. We have developed an habit to do things, have been successful, so we start from ourselves. Those companies never start from themselves. They always start from the user. You could say it's also beautiful from a Catholic perspective. I look at my user, not at myself. Well, that's another story, and we'll talk about values as well. But the sole fact that you focus not on your company, not on how you do things, but on the users, makes a huge change. If you think about it, Google developed the search engine and then developed Android. Android is the first competitor of the search engine. And it made so that Amazon became bigger than Google as a search engine. So we created our own competition. But we are now on another business. So to go now to jobs. Let me give you another example, Africa. We've been training 1 million people in Africa on web technologies. And if you think about Africa, they didn't have banks. And the reason why difficulty to fund to create jobs is that they didn't have banks. With the mobile phones, M-Pesa arrived, and operators like Orange started to develop banks on phones. And this allowed small and medium business to born because they can exchange money and they can create the flows. So they leapfrogged, and they leapfrogged the stage of the infrastructure and then went to something different. So I think all that, in terms of mentality, is important. Now let me quickly, and I'll end up in 3 minutes, go to values. The mission that my company works on is providing world's information, make it useful and accessible to everyone. And it's clear that we understand the responsibility this creates into making sure that this is really for everyone, and then this access to information is as much as possible universal. If you think about it, providing access to a mobile phone to a big part of the population means giving access to information. When the cost of a mobile phone goes below 50 euros, it makes a big change. In terms of job creation, let me give you a couple of numbers. In Europe, according to the European Commission, by 2018, the application sector, which are those small apps that are on phones, will employ about 5 million people and contribute 63 billion to the European economy. Is the fastest and biggest sectors of any growth, sorry, is the fastest and biggest growth of any sector in Europe in the last years. It was 0 4 years ago. It will be about plus 4.8 million in a year. Last year, 1.3 million people developed applications in Europe on Android and Apple, and it's 23% of the global base. Now the issue, half of the population, 47% of the population in Europe is not digitally skilled, and 90% of the jobs will require digital skills. So as a solution, what do we think we have to do? We believe education is important, and we've contributed to creating courses online that have been followed by 2 million people in Europe in the last 2 years, so that they understand the basics of communications, not technology, how communication works in the technology world, because as Professor Besson said, technology may change, but the fact that it's about communication doesn't. And so the methods we learn by doing those courses, teach by doing those courses, is understanding how this works. So I think it's important to continue the effort on education, to create something so that the universities and schools teach those bases of communication, that we understand that it's a communication issue and nothing else. Let me now conclude so I stay within my time. If I think about it, this change we are living in communications is an extraordinary opportunity to allow everyone to access information. A child in Asia or in Africa can learn about mathematics. An adolescent can go to Stanford staying where he is. We can understand the world around us by using those technologies. Yes, YouTube, our channel with video, sometimes can be used for fun, and it's used for fun about 60% of times. But 40% of time it's used to learn, to find courses, to understand things. That's a huge power, also a huge responsibility, but I think we can share that technology to make better. The internet enables people from completely different backgrounds to connect to each other, to exchange a diversity of opinion and ideas. And why is communication so powerful? Because you will learn from each other. We learn from the differences. We learn from people around the world that think different things, and we enrich ourselves by somehow embracing those differences. This incredible human network that has been created in the last years is an extraordinary opportunity to interact, to give, to support, and to innovate. And I think that the most important thing we can do is to share the basis of the understanding of the changes technology brings. Because if we do that, we can bridge the gap. I am convinced that as it happens today in Africa, where people that didn't have jobs can find them thanks to these technologies, and they now have one of the highest growths in the economy globally. If our economy here accepts that education is the challenge, if we do it, we can make a huge change. Let me end up by quoting 2 popes. I think those 2 quotes, to me, humbly, are very important in understanding what happens to technology and what we are. The first one is from Paul VI, who said that nothing makes us stronger than a call for help. Nothing makes us stronger than a call for help. Well, if you think about it, sharing communication and technology is continuously helping each other. There is an element of that in the communication that makes it powerful. It's not the technology, it's the communication element. And the second one, you all remember John Paul II saying, no, don't be scared. Accept the change and embrace it so that you can look forward. I think that, if we look at what happened in the world in the last years, we see turmoil, we see effectively things that concern us, like happened in the US or Brittany or some other things. But I think if we want peace, we need to work for justice. And working for justice means really doing things that are for everyone, forgetting ourselves a bit and working to build for everyone. If we can do that and start with education, I think we can contribute to a better world.
Thank you very much. I think we have much to think about how information now has become the source of value. I mean, we're used to a labor theory of value. I think we have now in the knowledge-based economy an information theory of value. And what is extraordinary, I think, as you concluded in your remarks, is that there are opportunities on this for all. Because I always remember this a book by Hernando de Soto, you may recall a few years back. He was saying that even the poor in the developing world, he owns a hut, he owns a bed, and he could use that. If he could make use of that and use it as collateral for having access to a loan, then he could really, so in a way, he has some wealth to rely upon. And everybody has some wealth to rely on, and that's the case of information, because I think if you have access to information and you are the source of information, you are part of some kind of supply chain or value chain. This is great, and I think now we move to the third speaker, Raul Gonzalez Fabri. Raul is a professor, teaches at Comillas, the prestigious Comillas University in Madrid. Is a university run by Jesuits, and Raul is a Jesuit himself. He's a teacher of economic and financial ethics, but he started as a civil and industrial engineer, if I'm not wrong. And so I think, you know, he went from designing and building bridges and machines to now teaching economics and microeconomics, and he also had an interesting experience working with the refugees. So I think definitely has a lot to say, based not only on his wisdom and what he has written and studied, but also based on his personal experience. And Raul, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you to you all, and to Professor Bessen by his very interesting presentation. I'm going to start. Microphone. It's not working? Yeah, it's working. Maybe? Like that? Okay. First thing, regarding the way of thinking these issues, I would like to differentiate between structures and stories. We may, I think, get quite wrong if we support our thought on stories. Everyone has a different story. Stories are only relevant as far as we are able to describe the structures behind, and we are able to say that those structures have some kind of universality. So I think it's a risk moving forward in those matters with a story from here or from there. Actually, things are changing so quickly that everyone can find a story for whatever conclusion wants to draw. I have been a professor in microeconomics. I am a professor in ethics and economics at the moment. I would say that the main structure we have to take or put attention on is a microeconomic structure, that is a structure of competition among the companies. And that's the point where I disagree from Professor Pastor, who spoke at the beginning, commenting basically the papers beforehand. Whatever can be done by a machine, he said a robot, I would think more of a machine, will be done by a machine sooner than later because it's very likely to be economically profitable. So in the competency among the companies, whatever is more profitable will be done. Whoever does it will gain a certain competitive advantage, and in the end, all of the rest will imitate that company. So there is a microeconomic logic behind that could only be stopped, I believe, by a political logic. But there is no possible political dynamics at the world level at the moment. I think in Laudato Si, the Pope told that regarding the ecological issue. Benedict XVI has asked before for a political global governance or political global authority. There is no one, and before another popes. No? Because there is a strong economic incentive for automation in the sense that it lowers the costs, and then it gives you a competitive advantage. And the ones leading that automation are precisely the companies, the ones investing money, and they are investing money because they expect to earn more money. That's the whole point of investment. Then I would say that from a structural point of view, there is little doubt that substitution of workers with machines is going to happen, is a trend. I liked the curve proposed by Professor Bessen, or projected by him, regarding workers in the clothes industry that shows a structure. There is a structure that lowers the number of workers, and that's automation. And there is a structure that tends to raise the number of workers, that is the increase in the demand. So at a certain point, increase in the demand governs the process, and from the point of saturation in the demand, it's governed by actually the automation of the process. So I think that's a deep structure. If you think how is it going to happen that machine work is going to replace jobs, I would think of three possible scenarios, not only of computers replacing people, but also of computer plus people time, only that free customer time replaces paid jobs. So that's already happening. Very little travel agencies are going to survive to the automation of the ability to buy a ticket on the internet. And it's not the machine buying, making the ticket for us alone. It's the machine plus us. Only that our work is free. It's for free for the machine owner. And then there is a third scheme that adds to the two previous elements, an element of cheap labor, because technology is becoming more and more user-friendly, and also friendly to the worker using it. And that's quite clear if you see how these guys in Starbucks or all these chains of fast food use their computers. If it is not there, they cannot do it. It's simply they mark. And then you are replacing the all-skilled waiter with someone who knows how to handle that thing and the palm he has. Okay. Then I would say there are three ways. Then I would think it's not only replacing workers by computers, but also replacing workers with computers and customers, and replacing skilled workers with friendly computers plus customers plus unskilled workers. Regarding the speed of the process, 10, 20 years look to me like a rather short term regarding the training of people. That is, people who are just 12 years old now are going to have their entry in the labor market by the end of that period, by the end of 10, 20 years from now. But we have to design their secondary and high school according to what we can guess will happen from 10, 20 years from now. So I agree with Professor Bessing in that two things are going to be important. There will happen a displacement of jobs from the current structure to the sectors where they are more difficult to replace with machines, and a good technical base shared by everybody will make a competitive advantage for a society and a good starting point for the following challenge that technology may bring to us. I think that quite close, that is 20 years would be an early challenge because it's a one generation challenge from now. I would say that it's very important that our school system, universities, vocational training, and whatever, teaches our kids the basics. And they do not employ time in doing what the companies must do themselves. We have, I believe, a lot of time employed in internships, in practices in companies, in whatever. It's actually very cheap labor force for the companies. I wouldn't go that way because that's time that is subtracted to the time necessary to learn the basics in mathematics, communication, programmation, whatever makes the future worker able to master the technology instead of being mastered by it. Finally, I have very few seconds for my last comment. My last comment would be the following. The situation is getting worse. That is all what I have described or whatever one can imagine from it is worse only if we think that jobs are extremely important and not having a job is a great tragedy. In my opinion, the situation is not getting worse, but better, thanks to that. This, my opinion, is rather positive on the opposite side. I do not believe that work is the key, or jobs are the key for human realization. This 2 centuries ago, nobody would have said in the Catholic Church that jobs are the keys for human realization, not for anything. Contemplation was at the time. Then we can think of education not as, or not alone, not only, as making our kids able for getting a job, but maybe better making them able for living, for developing their skills, even if they are not paid for them, for making them more able to contemplate. I can elaborate a bit more on this, but 0 is very clear. So being respectful of the moderator, I won't do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The inexorable laws of time, I think. Many thanks, really, for staying also in the time. But I think you're pointing towards also the risks and threats. It's extremely important because we have to also see the risks that all these developments create. And also you're mentioning at the end, I hope that we'll get back to it, the role of Catholic social thinking and the new perspective, the new dimensions that probably we need in facing so different a context now. I think this is also something that needs being further explored. And now I turn to the final speaker in the panel, Oliver Röttich. Oliver is the head of Uni-Europe, is the European Service Workers Union, I think it's a big organization, part of the labor movement, and represents many unions, something like 330 unions, and something like 7 million employees, if I'm not wrong. And he has had a distinguished career in the union movement. He is also a member of the steering committee of ETUC, the European Trade Union Organization. He has worked also in other sectors, not only the service sector, but finance. I think you were working in finance during the financial crisis, as seen from the unions and the workers' perspective. He has a strong background in history, law, and political science, and in various universities. Having said that, I'm very pleased to give him the floor.
Paolo, thank you very much. And let me start with 2 preliminary remarks. First of all, talking from the perspective of trade unions, what I notice in Europe is that workers feel uneasy, some are scared about what the future brings. And they have the feeling that society in their countries does not deliver for them anymore. And we see this especially in Southern Europe, but this goes to Britain. You saw the Brexit vote there. And they turn to populism, to somebody who gives them easy answers. And I think the challenge for us in society, especially in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, is to bring this back, to bring them back into the society that they see that society actually serves them as well. The second point is, in preparing for this meeting, I have reread Cardinal Marx' Das Kapital, and I'm always surprised again how close Catholic social teaching and what we as trade unions are saying is really. I mean, it's almost the same, and which is not too much of a surprise. Some of my member organizations are, of course, Christian trade unions as well, and there we really come together. Talking about skills and qualification is really one of the key challenges for the next year, because things are changing so rapidly. What I think is important, that we provide as society, as governments, a structure and a process that we can cope with these challenges. Now, one easy approach is, and that was a Dutch employer who said to me earlier this year, is it's very easy. Skills will be outdated every about 5 years. And what we do, we only give people temporary contracts, and if they haven't upskilled after 5 years, they don't get a job. I think that is too easy and cannot really be our view as trade unions, and I think neither as society or the church. What I really still aspire to is a goal that a worker has a decent job, decent working condition, decent pay, and this with a perspective for life. This might not be one job for life, but that there is a structure that you actually can be confident that for your family you don't have to be at the abyss every 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And for some people, when we look at the online world of people just going every morning to the computer and just trying to find a job for the day, which brings us back to the very start of capitalism. What I want to look here is at 3 key challenges which fall into the subject area of qualifications and skills. One is the speed and unpredictability. The second is the influence of globalization and companies. And the third is what it means for the workforce. And then I will give at the end some ideas how we can do this. First, looking at speed and unpredictability. The magnitude of change I want to illustrate in the way that some people say every 5 to 10 years, in the next 5 to 10 years, 40% of the jobs that each of you are doing is statistically disappearing. So one solution might be you find 40% extra work to do, but the other solution is you don't find anything, and what do? Or what do your employer says if he doesn't have anything you can work for in 40%. So that is one of the challenges. The second one is the speed of change. I mean, we are always thinking, okay, we're talking about 5 to 10 years, but it is actually accelerating. So the 5, 10 years will be in future 4 and 8 years and so on. So we have to go ever quicker that our skills are actually outdated. So the traditional linear approach of identifying what new skills are needed, then making a curriculum, training the teachers basically then go to the schools, train the people, and then the people use their skills. How do you want to do this in 5 years? That is almost impossible. And that means for us, for society, for companies, the future becomes unpredictable. You have to guess in what skills you actually have to invest. And guessing means, in the end, there is a big risk that you guess wrongly. And especially if you don't have really skills, if you have to live with not having a job all the time, you have temporary employment, how do you feel if you really don't know where to go? And the same is true for society. Where do you invest into? So I think one of the key questions that we have to ask, how can we set up a system where we make choices very quick, in ever shorter intervals, and with less knowledge about the future? And it cannot be, for me, the survival of the fittest country, company, or citizen. The third aspect is globalization and companies. And there, first of all, digitalization in particular makes the world become accessible for all of us. This means also that workers are no longer competing just with the workforce in the country, but with workers everywhere in the world, especially in the services sector. And that is a challenge, and it's also a challenge for companies, because if I get cheaper workers upskilled in India, because they come from universities and I get it in Germany, then there is an incentive for me to actually relocate services there. Also, when I look at companies, they are a lot now multinational entities, and their leadership doesn't really have a really strong feeling for their home country. They might not even be coming from the home country. You have all work organizations structured so that departments are actually spread all over the world, so they're not really national. At the same time, you still have the qualification and skill systems as we know it, based at the national level. So what do we do about it? And moreover, in this context, you have the core workforce that a company wants to have, which is shrinking. They want to focus on the highly skilled ones. The rest, they just simply buy in, source from the rest of the world, which of course is also rather an effective mechanism. If you don't know what the future brings, then it's much easier to really have only core skills and the rest you buy in as necessary. I mean, in a really bad world, you would have a franchise where the company management is only the strategic department, and that is a company, and everything else is bought in and chucked off if necessary. So the question for us is there, how do we actually bring companies to put their strengths into a specific nation and help us in society, in our countries, to actually profit from it? So how basically can we incentivize it that they are not global players only, but local players as well? In terms of the workforce, the third point, there I think, and I disagree there from James, that we will have the biggest impact in the services sector and on mid-skilled jobs. One example I recently heard was that apparently one CEO of a major insurance company in Europe said, well, in 5 years' time, I don't know what to do with 90% of my staff. 90%, 90, which are medium-skilled jobs, well-earning jobs, so people who are quite happy, have made a career, and then they might just disappear. And a key problem in that respect as well is many of those colleagues are actually women. For them, the jobs in an insurance industry are actually jobs which are at a higher level of what they can achieve in most of our societies. So with the changes which are coming, we're in big danger that the pay gap, the opportunities between women and men are actually getting worse than they have been today. And also, when we see a shrink of the medium-level jobs, it also means automatically de-skilling. There will be more high-level jobs, but much more lower-level jobs. So we need to address this. And on top of this, we have hyper-flexible jobs. That is, temporary jobs, more people doing self-employed jobs on a short-term contract. We have the people who work on online platforms who might have a job or otherwise get a job once a day or every 2 seconds when you do some of the gig jobs. And then, taking all this together, think about the pressure on a worker. He or she has to upskill within 5 years or less in future, has to make the right choices, has to pay for it because it's not clear whether the company or the state will pay for it. So how actually will we set a framework to do so? So my view as a trade unionist, and I think in the end also with Catholic social teaching, is we should use at the toolbox we actually have created over the last 100 years. And I think there it's a question of solidarity, subsidiarity, and everybody working together on the common good. And one key point for both the church and also the trade unions is have functioning collective bargaining social partnership. And I think that we have to enhance. And one point which is an advantage of this, it's the workers and the employers, the businesses, were the closest to the change, rather than having somehow the market dealing with it. Let the people we know best, because they are the closest doing the work. The easiest point there is, of course, saying each company should do it on itself. There are, however, some problems with this. First of all, more and more people are self-employed, so you won't cover them. The second point is you have companies who have the money and can do it, and you have others who can't. So you will increase inequality if you just leave it to the companies. So what we want is an industrial, a sectoral approach for getting a system in society for skills and qualification, bringing the stakeholders together. Last word, the key challenge is collective bargaining is under threat, especially at sectoral level. So my call is really to all parts of society to get together and really make sure that collective bargaining works again, so that workers in the process are not really forgotten. And what we do, we get human dignity and the common good back into the center stage with solidarity and by subsidiarity. Thank you.